Okay. Well, when we left off, Jane had just discovered that uh, poor Mr. Poor Mr. Rochester, poor Jane. Their wedding has just been interrupted by Richard Mason and Mr. Briggs, who is a lawyer, who Mr. Mason had uh, kind of enlisted to help stop this wedding. And So, so actually, Mr. Briggs is there already, but Mr. Mason hasn't shown up. But he is Mr. Briggs has read an affidavit stating that Mr. Rochester is married to his sister, to Richard Mason's sister, who is still living. And so because and so But Mr. Rochester says, well, that if a genuine document may prove I have been married, but it does not prove that the woman mentioned therein as my wife is still living. So, and then the lawyer, Mr. Rochester, he's grasping at straws here. But the lawyer says, well, she was living 3 months ago. And Rochester's like, well, how do you know? And Mr. Briggs says, well, I have a witness. And Rochester, he says, produce him or go to hell. So he's an unhappy dude right now. And so Mr. Briggs it's actually kind of funny how Mr. Briggs responds. He says, I'll produce him first. And so here comes Mr. Mason. And Mr. Rochester, on hearing the name, set his teeth. He experienced, too, a sort of strong, convulsive quiver. Near to him as I was, I felt the spasmodic movement of fury or despair run through his frame. The second stranger, who had hitherto lingered in the background, now drew near. A pale face looked over the solicitor's shoulder. Yes, it was Mason himself. Mr. Rochester turned and glared at him. His eye, as I have often said, was a black eye. It had now a tawny, nay, a bloody light in its gloom, and his face flushed. Olive cheek and hueless forehead received a glow as from spreading, ascending heart fire. And he stirred, lifted his strong arm. He could have struck Mason, dashed him on the church floor, shocked by a ruthless blow the breath from his body. But Mason shrank away and cried faintly, good God. Contempt fell cool on Mr. Rochester. His passion died as if a blight had shriveled it up. He only asked, what have you to say? So this is a marvelous description of how Mr. Rochester looks at Mason. He looks scary. Like you can see the rage on his face, and Jane describes it so well. His a bloody light in his eye, and he's so scary that Mason kind of shrinks back and says, "Good God!" He's about to get his ass beat. Apparently, he's afraid that that's going to happen here. But and so. But Rochester kind of chills out. He's like, okay, he's kind of built up, and now he kind of eases back, and he says, well, what have you to say? And poor Mason is so scared that he can't say anything. And um, and and Rochester says, the devil is in it if you cannot answer distinctly. I again demand, what have you to say? And he says, because he has mentioned the devil, the clergyman says, sir, interrupted the clergyman, do not forget you are in a sacred place. So that's kind of that's how angry Rochester is. He has completely forgotten uh, um, decorum here, and so the lawyer kind of gets Mason to kind of brace himself up and tell the minister what's going on. And um, he said, Mason says, I saw her there last April. I am her brother. And the clergyman says at Thornfield Hall, ejaculated the clergyman, impossible. I am an old resident of in this neighborhood, sir, and I never heard of a Mrs. Rochester at Thornfield Hall. I saw a grim smile contort Mr. Rochester's lip, and he muttered, no, by God, I took care that none should hear of it, or of her under that name. He mused for 10 minutes. He held counsel with himself. He formed his resolve and announced it. Enough. All shall bolt out at once like the bullet from the barrel. Wood, close your book and take off your surplice. John Green to the clerk. Leave the church. There will be no wedding today. The man obeyed. And so, Rochester knows he's been beat now, but he's not going to be happy about it. And he is going to, he's going to make sure these people understand why he felt like he had to do this. He says, bigamy is an ugly word. I meant, however, to be a bigamist, but fate has outmaneuvered me, or Providence has checked me. Perhaps the last. I am little better than a devil at this moment, and as my pastor there would tell me, deserve no doubt the sternest judgments of God, even to the quenchless fire and deathless worm. Gentlemen, my plan is broken up. What this lawyer and his client say is true. I have been married, and the woman to whom I was married lives. You say you never heard of a Mrs. Rochester at the house up yonder wood, but I dare say you have many a time inclined your ear to gossip about the mysterious lunatic kept there under watch and ward. Some have whispered to you that she is my bastard half-sister, some my cast-off mistress. I now inform you that she is my wife, whom I married 15 years ago, Bertha Mason by name, sister of this resolute personage, who is now with his quivering limbs and white cheeks showing you what a stout heart men may bear. Cheer up, Dick. Never fear me. I'd almost as soon strike a woman as you. Bertha Mason is mad, and she came from a mad family, idiots and maniacs through 3 generations. And here we get some of the history of Bertha and kind of how he ended up with her. But before I get into that, it's so funny to me the way that he talks to Mason here. He's just like, I'd almost as soon strike a woman. Now this is a massive insult, because he's basically comparing him to a woman. It's like he kind of feels like, and Mason has kind of proven to have a weak character, although I don't really like the idea of women being perceived as having weak characters, or anyway, but Jane certainly doesn't. But in any case, here we have a little bit of this history. He says that Bertha Mason is mad, and she came from of a mad family, idiots and maniacs through 3 generations, she says. Her mother, the Creole, was both a mad woman and a drunkard, as I found out after I had wed the daughter, for they were silent on family secrets before. Bertha, like a dutiful child, copied her parent in both points. So basically, she's a lunatic and a drunkard. I had a charming partner, pure, wise, modest. You can fancy that I was a happy man. I went through rich scenes. Oh, my experience has been heavenly, if you only knew it. But I owe you no further explanation. Briggs, Wood, Mason, I invite you all to come up to the house and visit Mrs. Poole's patient and my wife. You shall see what sort of a being I was cheated into espousing, and judge whether or not I had a right to break the compact and seek sympathy with something at least human. This girl, he continued, looking at me, knew no more than you would of the disgusting secret. She thought all was fair and legal, and never dreamed she was going to be entrapped into a feigned union with a defrauded wretch, already bound to a bad, mad, and embruted partner. Come, all of you, follow. So we find out that the mother was a mad woman and a drunkard, and so was Bertha. And so and he can Rochester's going a little bit nuts here. Like, he feels cheated. He was outmaneuvered, he says. And so now he's like, you know what? I'm going to show y'all what I have to deal with. And so they follow him up to the house, and they go on up to the third story, where Jane has always been told not to go, and from where she hears this laugh all the time. And now finally we get to see Bertha. In the deep shade at the further end of the room, a figure ran backward and forward. What it was, whether beast or human being, one could not at first sight tell. It groveled seemingly on all fours. It snatched and growled like some wild animal, but it was covered with clothing, and a quantity of dark grizzled hair, wild as a mane, hid its head and face. "Good morrow, Mrs. Poole," said Mr. Rochester. "How are you, and how is your charge today?" And Grace Poole says, "We're tolerable, sir, I thank you," replied Grace, lifting the boiling mess carefully onto the hob, rather snappish but not rageous. A fierce cry seemed to give the lie to her favorable report. The clothed hyena rose up and stood tall on its hind feet. "Ah, sir, she sees you," exclaimed Grace. "You'd better not stay." "Only a few moments, Grace. You must allow me a few moments." "Take care, then, sir. For God's sake, take care." The maniac bellowed. She parted her shaggy locks from her visage and gazed wildly at her visitors. "I recognize well that purple face, those bloated features." Mrs. Poole advanced. "Keep out of the way," said Mr. Rochester, thrusting her aside. "She has no knife now, I suppose, and I'm on my guard." "One never knows what she has, sir. She is so cunning. It is not in mortal discretion to fathom her craft." "We had better leave her," whispered Mason. "Go to the devil," was his brother-in-law's recommendation. "Where?" cried Grace. The three gentlemen retreated simultaneously. Mr. Rochester flung me behind him. The lunatic sprung and grappled his throat viciously and laid her teeth to his cheek. They struggled. She was a big woman, in stature almost equaling her husband, and corpulent besides. She showed virile force in the contest. More than once she almost throttled him, athletic as he was. He could have settled her with a well-planted blow, but he would not strike. He would only wrestle. At last he mastered her arms. Grace Poole gave him a cord, and he pinioned them behind her. With more rope which was at hand, he bound her to a chair. The operation was performed amid the fiercest yells and the most convulsive plunges. Mr. Rochester then turned to the spectators. He looked at them with a smile both acrid and desolate. "That is my wife," said he. "Such is the sole conjugal embrace I am ever. That is the sole conjugal embrace I am ever to know. Such are the endearments which are to solace my leisure hours, and this is what I wish to have," laying his hand on my shoulder. "This young girl who stands so grave and quiet at the mouth of hell, looking collectedly at the gambols of a demon. I wanted her just as a change after that fierce rag out wood and brick. Rag out. Okay, wooden bricks. Look at the difference. Compare these clear eyes with the red balls yonder, this face with that mask, this form with that bulk. Then judge me, priest of the gospel and man of the law, and remember with what judgment ye judge ye shall be judged. Off with you now. I must shut up my prize." So we've seen. So the way that Bertha is described is she's beyond any kind of. Well, of course, there's no such thing as therapy back in those days, but she's beyond what anybody can do for her, because she's described as looking like a wild animal. She almost seemed to be on all fours when they came into the room. And as soon as she sees Mr. Rochester, she freaks out and goes for him. And she actually grabs him and tries to wrestle with him and kind of goes for his throat and tries to bite him, and she's just basically crazy. Now, but here's the thing, though, is we've talked about this before. Like, yes, she's mad. Yes, she's somewhat animal-like. But would she have been in such a mood, as it were? Would she have been so violent if it weren't for Jane? Now, that's a question we don't know the answer to, but one can assume, like we've said before, she's aware. She's aware of what's going on with Jane and Rochester, and so she probably is pretty mad about it. But at the same time, she doesn't deal with it like a human is, or a sane person, as Jane says here. She's more like an animal, and she doesn't even really say anything. She just basically screams and yells and everything like that, and tries to attack. But even amongst all of this, Jane has to tell us that Rochester didn't hit her. He just kind of tried to contain her a little bit and wrestle with her. And finally, they have to tie her up. They have to tie her up before she'll chill out. And then Mr. Rochester turns to the people there, and you do kind of feel, you feel sorry for him at this point. It's like the way that he states it. He says, such is the sole conjugal embrace I am ever to know. Such are the endearments which are to solace my leisure hours. So basically, the conjugal embrace is her attacking him, and the endearments are her screaming at him. And so you do feel sorry for him. And so they all kind of, after all of this, they leave the tower, and Rochester is kind of trying to chill Bertha out while everybody leaves. And then we get poor Jane. You feel so sorry for her at this point, and this makes it even worse to me. Briggs, he says, Briggs mentions her uncle, and she says, my uncle, what of him? Do you know him? Mr. Mason does. Mr. Eyre has been the feudal correspondent of his house for some years, which is the capital of Madeira, feudal. When your uncle received your letter intimating the contemplated union between yourself and Mr. Rochester, Mr. Mason, who was staying at Madeira to recruit his health on his way back to Jamaica, happened to be with him. Mr. Eyre mentioned the intelligence, for he knew that my client here was acquainted with a gentleman of the name of Rochester. Mr. Mason, astonished and distressed, as you may suppose, revealed the real state of matters. Your uncle, I am sorry to say, is now on a sick bed, from which, considering the nature of his disease, decline, and the stage it has reached, it is unlikely he will ever rise. He could not then hasten to England himself to extricate you from the snare into which you had fallen, but he implored Mr. Mason to lose no time in taking steps to prevent the false marriage. He referred him to me for assistance. I used all dispatch, and am thankful I was not too late, as you doubtless must be also. Were I not morally certain that your uncle will be dead ere you reach Madeira, I would advise you to accompany Mr. Mason back. But as it is, I think you had better remain in England till you can hear further, either from or of Mr. Eyre. Have we anything else to stay for? He inquired Mr. Mason. So, so to add insult to injury, Jane finds out that she is the reason that this wedding got interrupted. Now, as far as the society and morality and all that is concerned, it was a close shave, and she's probably in some way grateful. But I always feel like she's just devastated. Like she almost wishes that it didn't happen, that she didn't know. But at the same time, she's probably, Jane being Jane, she probably is happy that she escaped a bigamous marriage, as it were. But she wrote, remember, she wrote to her uncle in Madeira about not long after she got back from Gateshead, after the aunt died. And come to find out that her uncle and the Masons know each other, because they're both in the wine business. They're both wine merchants, and so they know each other. And it just so happens that she sees that Mason visits Mr. Eyre, and they talk about Jane and the fact that she's married in Rochester. And so because of Jane, Mr. Mason finds out about it. And that's what brings them back to England to stop the marriage. So yeah, so I always feel sorry for her at this point. It's like, man, I'm the reason that this happened. But at the same time, it's all, and Rochester's the one who was trying to marry her when he was already married. So it's one of those catch-22 kind of things, you know. But in any case, after all of this, she's just, she can't take anymore, and so she goes back to her room. She says, the house cleared, I shut myself in, fastened the bolt that none might intrude, and proceeded not to weep, not to mourn. I was yet too calm for that, but mechanically to take off the wedding dress and replace it by the stuff gown I had worn yesterday, as I thought, for the last time. I then sat down. I felt weak and tired. I leaned my arms on a table and my head dropped on them. And now I thought, till now I had only heard, seen, moved, followed up and down where I was led or dragged, watch event rush on event, disclosure open beyond disclosure. But now I thought. So Jane hasn't had a chance to think yet. But now she's in her room by herself. She's put on her normal clothes, and now she's thinking. And that's, as we all know, when we go through something like that, something that's hectic or emotionally draining, like a funeral or anything, something like that, you have to start going on autopilot. And that's what Jane's been doing, and she hasn't really had a chance to think. And so now she's sitting here and she's thinking. She says the morning had been a quiet morning enough, all except the brief scene with the lunatic. The transaction in the church had not been noisy. There was no explosion of passion, no loud altercation, no dispute, no defiance or challenge, no tears, no sobs. A few words had been spoken, a calmly pronounced objection to the marriage made, some stern short questions put by Mr. Rochester, answers, explanations given, evidence adduced. An open admission of the truth had been uttered by my master. Then the living proof had been seen. The intruders were gone, and all was over. I was in my own room as usual, just myself, without obvious change. Nothing had smitten me or scathed me or maimed me. And yet, where was Jane Eyre yesterday? Where was the Jane Eyre of yesterday? Where was her life? Where were her prospects? Poor Jane. Bless her heart. Jane Eyre, who had been an ardent, expectant woman, almost a bride, was a cold, solitary girl again. Her life was pale. Her prospects were desolate. A Christmas frost had come at midsummer. A white December storm had whirled over June. Ice glazed the ripe apples, drifts crushed the glowing roses. On hayfield and cornfield lay a frozen shroud. Lanes which last night blushed full of flowers, today were pathless with untrodden snow. And the woods which 12 hours since waved leafy and fragrant as groves between the tropics, now spread waste, wild and white as pine forests in wintry Norway. My hopes were all dead, struck with a subtle doom, such as in one night fell on all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. I looked on my cherished wishes, yesterday so blooming and glowing. They lay stark, chill, livid corpses that could never revive. I looked at my love, that feeling which was my master's, which he had created. It shivered in my heart like a suffering child in a cold cradle. Sickness and anguish had seized it. It could not seek Mr. Rochester's arms. It could not derive warmth from his breast. Oh, nevermore could it turn to him, for faith was blighted, confidence destroyed. Mr. Rochester was not to me what he had been, for he was not what I had thought him. I would not ascribe vice to him. I would not say he had betrayed me, but the attribute of stainless truth was gone from his idea, and from his presence I must go. That I perceived well. When, how, whither, I could not yet discern. But he himself, I doubted not, would hurry me from Thornfield. Real affection, it seemed, he could not have for me. It had been only fitful passion that was bought. He would want me no more. I should fear even to cross his path now. My view must be hateful to him. Oh, how blind had been my eyes, how weak my conduct. So Jane is sitting here. She's comparing her state of mind to her sudden change of situation to winter coming in the middle of summer. Like everything is all right, is all green and verdant and alive, and then all of a sudden the frost comes and destroys all of it, and that's how she feels, and that's how anybody would feel in this situation, I imagine. But she goes a step further, and she's like, well, surely, she decides that, number one, she decides that she needs to leave. She can't be here anymore. But she goes a step further and is like, well, he's probably going to make me leave himself. All I was to him was a distraction, and now that the distraction has been made aware, it's like for some reason she feels like that's going to make him love her less. For some reason she feels like he was just interested in her because she was a distraction. But now that she knows about it, what would she want with him? What would he want with her? And so she's thinking, well, I'm just going to leave, and he's going to want me to leave anyway, so that's what I'm going to do. And bless her heart, she goes on, and she's laying there, and she says, I lay faint, longing to be dead. One idea only still throbbed lifelike within me, a remembrance of God. It begot an unuttered prayer. These words went wandering up and down in my rayless mind as something that should be whispered, but no energy was found to express them. Be not far from me, for trouble is near. There is none to help. It was near, and as I had lifted no petition to heaven to avert it, as I had neither joined my hands, nor bent my knees, nor moved my lips, it came. In full heavy swing, the torrent poured over me. The whole consciousness of my life lorn, my love lost, my hope quenched, my faith death-struck, swayed full and mighty above me in one sullen mass. That bitter hour cannot be described in truth. The waters came into my soul. I sunk into deep mire. I felt no standing. I came into deep waters. The floods overflowed me. So that's the end of the chapter. So poor Jane is in this deep, deep depression now. She says she wants to die, basically. But then she says, well, wait a minute. Here comes the Helen Burns back to her. It's like a remembrance of God, she says, and she feels this. And although she doesn't feel the hope, she thinks of of a passage of the line, be not far from me, for trouble is near. There is none to help. So now there's none to help Jane. And so she looks to the only thing that she knows will help, and that is her belief in God. And so she's just basically laying there processing all this and not really able to think about what comes next. And so that's where she leaves it at the end of that chapter. All of that, bless her, all of this hope and all of this sunshine and all of this excitement just ripped away because of this woman that Rochester is married to. And so, what could a woman, and how, it makes you wonder, how would you react? How would you react to that sort of, how would you react to that sort of situation? And you're in love with this person, and you're going to marry them, and you want to marry them, and you're looking forward to it. And you find out that they have this dark secret that keeps you from marrying them, although it's not really their fault, although it's something that you can't really blame them for. But it ends everything that you hope to have with that person. What do you do in that situation? And that is one of the and that's one of those things that I really love about Jane Eyre, is that sense of self that stays with her even through these moments. That in addition to that little bit of Helen Burns that she still got, and that faith that she has, that hope. And that's one of those things that I think is one of the greatest takeaways from Jane Eyre, is to always maintain that hope. And so there we go.